ever wonder why everyone on your team describes what you do a little bit different? Now, when we look at this might not seem like a big problem, right? And probably just because of the way the question is phrased. So the word little here is almost minimizing the issue, because if it truly was little variances, who cares, right? Now, I know for some companies, they like consistency, almost to a militant level, right? Because I've seen some companies that say, this is the deck, this is the talk track, this is the message, and you will not vary from it, not a single word. And while I appreciate kind of the need or the desire for consistency, that can be problematic, because if you're so busy memorizing a perfect script, there's all kinds of issues that go with that. So that's a separate problem, and we'll address that in a separate video. But for the sake of argument, let's say that it's not actually little variance. It's a lot, right? There's a lot of inconsistency, so much so that it's problematic, right? So let's kind of ignore the word little for a moment. And so in that situation where you have a lot of variability and people aren't telling the same story, why is that problematic? And part of why it is twofold. So one, you have different sellers, right? So if we say seller one, seller two, and then over here you have two buyers. So we'll say buyer one and buyer two. So in one sense, you could say, all right, well, even if these sellers are telling different stories and they're not describing what you do in the same way, does it matter, right? Because if seller A is selling to buyer A and seller B is selling to buyer B, and they just hear this one talk track, doesn't matter, right? This buyer B or buyer A doesn't know what buyer B is saying or hearing, and so why does it matter if there's inconsistency? And that could be true, but here's where it gets problematic, and there's two reasons. So number one is, what happens when one of these sellers wins or one of them loses? Okay, so let's say that seller A is successful and they win and they get the deal, and seller B, they fail and they get a no. Now, all of a sudden, when you're trying to say, okay, how can we increase our win rate? How can we get more revenue and more customers? You start to look to say, okay, what's working and what's not? That's where it becomes problematic, because there's so much inconsistency that you don't know, right? So you can go back and you can look at the decks and you can look at the talk track here, look at the talk track here, but it just creates this massive investigation trying to figure out what's working and what's not to be able to replicate or stop. A good example is, I love to cook, but I'm a poor baker, right? And the reason being is baking is science. It's exact, where cooking is art, right? So every time I'm in the kitchen cooking, I'm just throwing stuff in and see what happens. Sometimes it's terrible, sometimes it's awesome. The problem is, when I cook a good dish and my family's like, whoa, like this is a winner, we want this every single time, and I have to replicate it, I have no idea what happened in the kitchen, right? There was a bunch of spices and stuff happening there, and so I'm trying to go back and remember, but it makes it really difficult to replicate success because you're not really sure what's what. So that's the first problem. The second problem is this: these sellers work for the same organization, right? And so what happens is, when they are selling to buyers, each one of them is kind of creating this vision in the buyer's minds. And so when you have your operations folks back here, and they are responsible not for the selling, but the actual delivery of what you sell, now all of a sudden it gets problematic, because customer A has this vision, customer B has this vision, right? And so now all of a sudden operations has to figure out, what exactly did you sell and what did you tell them? And that's not really what we do. And so they're constantly scrambling, trying to make sense of all of this variability. So not only does it make it hard to kind of replicate sales success, it makes it really hard to deliver at an excellent level. And why this is problematic, because you could think, oh, this is just an operations problem, who cares? The reason being is, when you think about getting more money from existing customers, right? So a big opportunity for a lot of companies is expansion of wallet share. It's your existing customers that have already bought from you. Can you get them to buy more from you? Now, to do that, you have to be able to deliver value consistently. And so when you're stacking the deck against your ops people to be able to succeed, ultimately that means the chance that these guys are going to buy more from you is going down. And so both of these problems relate to revenue, just in different ways. And so it's just important that as you're thinking about how to craft a message and how to help your sellers tell a consistent story, it's really important to be able to get them at least in the same ballpark, right? Telling a relatively same story without following verbatim a perfect script. Okay, so it is a bit of a balancing act, but when you get it right, revenue and success becomes so much easier to replicate and predict.